Ethan Williams, a charming young man with a taste for luxury, thought he had everything figured out when he began a whirlwind romance with the wealthy 82-year-old widow, Margaret Crane. But what started as a fairy tale soon turned into a deadly game of manipulation, betrayal, and greed. As Ethan's desire for Margaret's fortune grew, so did his darkness, leading him to commit the unthinkable: murder. Would his calculated plan go undetected, or would the truth catch up with him in the most unexpected way? In the heart of Beverly Hills, amidst sprawling mansions and towering gates, lived Margaret Crane, an 82-year-old woman whose wealth and power were well known across the city. A business magnate in her youth, Margaret had built a fortune through her sharp mind and relentless ambition. Over the years, her life had become one of solitude. She had no family to speak of, no children, no grandchildren, just a handful of friends who were all either too busy or too distant to visit regularly. Margaret spent her days in her massive estate, surrounded by expensive art, rare antiques, and a collection of vintage cars. But despite all her material possessions, there was a deep void in her life that she couldn't fill with money. That void was soon to be filled by Ethan Collins, a young man just 19 years old who had recently moved to Beverly Hills, hoping to escape the quiet confines of a small town in the Midwest. Ethan was tall, with tousled dark hair, and an easy smile that made people like him instantly. He had big dreams of breaking into the entertainment industry, and thought the move to California would be his ticket to success. But like many young people with limited means, he quickly found himself struggling to make ends meet. Living in a cramped apartment and working odd jobs, Ethan's life wasn't exactly the glamorous existence he had imagined. It was at a charity gala, held at one of the grandest venues in the city, where Ethan first met Margaret. The event was a sea of high society faces, with older, wealthy individuals mingling with young, beautiful socialites. Ethan had only attended the gala because he had managed to land a catering job through a friend of a friend. He had no business being in that world, but fate had a different plan. As he moved through the room, balancing trays of wine glasses, his gaze met Margaret's. She was seated alone at a corner table, dressed in a dazzling red gown that contrasted sharply with her silver hair. There was something about her, something that immediately caught Ethan's attention. Her aura of power and elegance made her seem like a queen among commoners. The moment their eyes locked, Ethan felt an electric spark between them. He smiled, offering a polite nod. Margaret, noticing the young man's energy and confidence, smiled back, intrigued. Ethan approached her table and they exchanged a few pleasantries. It was the beginning of a strange and unexpected connection. Margaret was drawn to Ethan's youthful exuberance, his charm, and his ability to make her laugh. For the first time in years, she felt seen by someone. Ethan, on the other hand, was fascinated by her wealth and the life she led. His eyes sparkled when he spoke to her, and it wasn't hard to tell that he was intrigued by her power and influence. He could tell she had everything, except for companionship. Over the next few weeks, their relationship grew. Ethan would show up at Margaret's estate uninvited, offering to help with small tasks around the house. He'd casually mention his dreams and aspirations, and Margaret, eager for some company, would listen attentively, offering advice when needed. As time went on, Ethan's visits became more frequent. At first it was all innocent, just a young man spending time with an older woman who had no one else. But there was a shift. Ethan began to stay for longer periods, and their conversations became more intimate. He listened attentively to Margaret's stories, pretending to care about her past business ventures, her late husband, and her many travels around the world. Before long, their relationship took a romantic turn. It started with small gestures, Ethan bringing Margaret flowers, spending time with her in the garden, and playing chess in the afternoons. To Margaret, it felt like a new chapter in her life, one where she wasn't alone. She had found a kindred spirit in Ethan, someone who was genuinely interested in her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt valued. She overlooked the occasional awkwardness of their age difference. After all, what was age when it came to companionship? But behind Ethan's charm and gentle demeanor, something darker was brewing. Ethan saw Margaret as more than just a companion. She was a means to an end. As their relationship deepened, he began to understand the true extent of her wealth. Margaret had amassed a fortune throughout her lifetime, and Ethan began to see how he could leverage that wealth for his own gain. His feelings for her became less about affection, and more about the luxurious life he could inherit if things went his way. What started as a seemingly innocent romance between a young man and an elderly woman quickly began to transform into something far more dangerous. Margaret, blinded by the attention and affection of a man who seemed to care for her, never saw the danger lurking in the shadows. As for Ethan, he continued to weave his web of lies and manipulation, drawing Margaret deeper into his world, all while plotting a future where he could have it all: the money, the power, and the life he had always dreamed of. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Margaret and Ethan deepened, though it was becoming increasingly clear that their relationship was not as innocent as it appeared. Margaret, despite her years of wisdom and experience, was blindsided by Ethan's charm. She found herself enjoying his company more and more, even as her friends and distant family members began to voice their concerns. They thought it odd, even distasteful, that a young man with no ties to her family would suddenly become so involved in her life. But Margaret was undeterred. Ethan had become a fixture in her daily routine, someone who kept her company, listened to her, and made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Ethan's transformation was equally noticeable, though in a far more sinister way. At first he had been polite, respectful, even doting on Margaret. He would bring her breakfast in bed, take her out for drives in her vintage car, and shower her with attention. But as time went on, his demeanor began to shift. He started to grow more demanding, requesting larger sums of money for personal projects, asking for lavish gifts and complaining about his lack of financial freedom. His youthful exuberance began to wear thin, replaced by a sense of entitlement. Margaret had always been generous, but she began to feel that Ethan was taking advantage of her kindness. Yet she couldn't bring herself to address it. The loneliness she had endured for so long made her afraid of losing the only person who seemed to care. Still, Margaret tried to ignore the subtle red flags. She was too enamored with Ethan's attention to truly question his intentions. At one point, Ethan began to suggest that they travel together, offering to take her on lavish vacations, but only on the condition that she contributed financially. Margaret, ever the businesswoman, had her reservations. She had spent her life amassing wealth, but she was not careless with it. She hesitated, feeling uncomfortable with the suggestion. Ethan, sensing her reluctance, became more insistent. He had learned quickly that Margaret could be easily manipulated, especially when it came to matters of money. One evening, Margaret invited Ethan to dinner at her estate, hoping to have a quiet evening of reflection. She wanted to talk to him about their future, to see if their relationship had any long-term potential. What she didn't know was that Ethan had already set his sights on a more dangerous plan. He had begun researching Margaret's finances, her estate, her investments, and the complicated web of trusts and assets that would be difficult to untangle. But what intrigued him the most was her will, a legal document that would determine who would inherit her fortune after her death. Ethan knew he had to be part of that will. Margaret had often mentioned how she had no family left, and Ethan had slowly positioned himself as her closest confidant. She spoke to him about her plans to donate a portion of her wealth to various charities and to set up a fund to ensure her community's welfare. But it wasn't enough for Ethan. He wanted everything. And if he couldn't inherit it by her goodwill, he was willing to make sure he got it another way. That night at dinner, Ethan played his usual role, charming Margaret with his wit and thoughtful conversation. But under the surface, his mind was churning. He began to subtly push Margaret toward changing her will, even suggesting that she leave a significant portion of her fortune to him, her closest friend and confidant. Margaret laughed it off at first, thinking it was just playful banter, but Ethan wasn't joking. He continued to press, making her feel guilty about the fact that she had no family to pass her wealth on to. The more he spoke, the more Margaret felt that perhaps it wasn't such a bad idea after all. After all, Ethan had been there for her when no one else was. That evening, after Margaret went to bed, Ethan sat alone in the grand living room, staring at the wealth surrounding him. The gold-framed portraits of Margaret's late husband, the glistening chandeliers, and the expensive antiques. Everything could be his. All he needed was one final push. He had already begun to see Margaret as a means to an end, no longer a person to care for, but an obstacle to be removed. He didn't love her. He never had. His affection for her had always been driven by a singular goal: money. Over the next few days, Ethan's demeanor became more insistent. He began to manipulate Margaret, playing on her emotions and guilt, convincing her that he deserved a greater share of her estate. He even started to suggest that the only way for her to truly ensure her legacy was to leave everything to him. Margaret, feeling confused and pressured, began to seriously consider the idea. She thought about how much Ethan had given her in terms of companionship and how much he seemed to care about her. Perhaps, she thought, he was right. Maybe it was time to take a step toward ensuring her wealth went to someone who truly understood its value. But something inside Margaret still resisted. She wasn't foolish. She had worked hard for everything she had. She was beginning to sense that Ethan's intentions were not as pure as they seemed. His requests had become increasingly audacious, and his charm was beginning to feel like manipulation. Yet, she hesitated, torn between the love she thought she had for him and the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. Deep down, Margaret knew that Ethan was no longer the charming young man she had first met at the gala. He had become a stranger, a man whose desires extended far beyond her companionship. What Margaret didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Ethan's obsession with her wealth had turned from a quiet desire into a dangerous obsession. His patience was running thin, and with every passing day his plan became more desperate. The more he learned about Margaret's estate, the clearer it became that if he couldn't have her fortune through love, he would take it through force. And in his mind, there was only one way to do that. The tension between Margaret and Ethan reached a breaking point as the days wore on. Ethan, now emboldened by the subtle manipulations he had executed so far, grew increasingly impatient with Margaret's indecision. He could no longer tolerate the idea of waiting for her to come around on her own. He had been clear about his desires, about what he thought he deserved, but Margaret's reluctance to fully give in to his demands was testing his resolve. She still held back, torn by guilt and a lingering sense of independence that she couldn't quite shake. This reluctance was now a barrier to Ethan's goal, and the more he pushed, the more Margaret seemed to pull away. It was time to act. Ethan had already begun laying the groundwork for his plan. He had done his research, learned the ins and outs of Margaret's estate, and discovered the ways in which she had structured her will. He knew about the charitable donations Margaret had promised to make, as well as the trust funds she had set up for various causes. He also knew that she had promised a large portion of her fortune to these charitable endeavors, something that Ethan found completely unacceptable. He had waited long enough to secure his place in her will, and now that time was running out. he was prepared to take extreme measures. One evening, he put his plan into motion. He had been helping Margaret with some tasks around the house, maintaining his facade of the concerned and attentive companion. But that evening, his act would take on a darker tone. Margaret had invited him to dinner, as she often did. It was a quiet night, and Margaret, still physically frail and often weary from the stress of her daily life, seemed unusually relaxed. Ethan, however, had a very different agenda in mind. This would be the night. He had carefully prepared a special meal for her, a delicious seafood dinner, something she'd always enjoyed. But Ethan had other ingredients in mind that night. Without Margaret knowing, he had laced her wine with a potent poison that would be almost impossible to detect in the early stages. The plan was to make it look like a natural death, something that could be easily explained away as a result of her age or health problems. But what Ethan didn't anticipate was how quickly the poison would take effect. He had expected it to work slowly, perhaps over the course of hours, allowing him time to make the situation appear unremarkable. But within an hour of finishing the meal, Margaret's health began to deteriorate rapidly. At first, Margaret simply complained of feeling lightheaded, which Ethan dismissed with concern and reassurance, though inwardly he felt a growing unease. He had been so sure of his plan's success, but now, as Margaret's face grew pale and her breathing became labored, he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Her frailty seemed to accelerate the effects of the poison, and her condition worsened before Ethan could even formulate a clear response. He tried to maintain his calm exterior, though inside, panic started to rise. He pretended to be concerned, trying to help her sit down, offering water and checking on her as if he had no idea what was happening. But deep down, he knew that nothing could save her now. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Margaret's eyes grew heavy, and her speech became slurred as the poison took hold. Ethan, once confident and calculating, found himself trapped in the reality of his actions. Margaret's life, the one thing he had worked so hard to secure, was slipping away, and all he could do was watch. His heart raced as he fought the mounting guilt and fear that began to claw at him. He realized that despite everything he had planned, he had underestimated one crucial aspect of the situation. Margaret was still a person, and he had made the mistake of treating her as a mere object to be used and discarded. Margaret's last moments were filled with confusion and a deep sense of betrayal. As she struggled to breathe, she looked up at Ethan with a mixture of disbelief and pain. There was no sudden realization in her eyes, no epiphany that the man she had trusted was responsible for her suffering. Instead, there was only the slow, suffocating certainty that something was terribly wrong. She had no idea how close she was to the end. She had no idea that the young man she had welcomed into her life was now the reason she would never wake again. As Margaret's breathing became shallow, Ethan's mind raced. The smooth plan he had envisioned had gone horribly awry, and now he was left with the terrifying task of covering his tracks. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He hadn't expected things to get so out of hand. Panic set in, but there was nothing he could do to reverse the situation. Margaret's death was inevitable, and Ethan knew that once she passed, his life would never be the same. When Margaret finally lost consciousness, Ethan's immediate concern wasn't her life, but rather what he had to do next. He had to act fast. He quickly moved her to a nearby chair, attempting to make her appear as though she had simply fallen asleep. He wiped away any trace of the poison, making sure there was no sign of foul play. In his mind, he had already rehearsed the story he would tell. Margaret had simply passed away in her sleep, the result of old age and poor health. But as he looked at her pale, lifeless face, he felt a gnawing emptiness deep in his chest. He had gotten what he wanted, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as he had imagined. In the hours that followed, Ethan did his best to maintain the facade of the grieving partner. He called the authorities, pretending to be shocked and devastated by Margaret's sudden death. He even shed a few tears, though they were forced and unconvincing. The investigators would likely see through his act soon enough, but for now, he played his part to perfection. Margaret was gone, and he had gotten away with it. He had taken the first step toward claiming the fortune he believed was rightfully his. But deep down, Ethan knew that Margaret's death, the way he had orchestrated it, was only the beginning of a far darker journey, one that would ultimately lead him to face the consequences of the choices he had made. As the days passed, the authorities began their investigation into Margaret Crane's sudden death. Ethan, who had meticulously planned every detail, found himself at the center of a web of suspicion. Despite his best efforts to maintain an air of innocence, there were small cracks in his story that began to appear. The detectives were thorough in their questioning, noticing inconsistencies in Ethan's timeline. He had claimed to have found Margaret in a peaceful sleep, but his description of the scene was vague and contradictory. His nervousness was palpable, though he tried his best to remain calm. Every time the investigators pressed him for more details, his discomfort grew, and that discomfort didn't go unnoticed. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came when the medical examiner's report came back. It confirmed that Margaret had died of poisoning, and while the exact substance remained undetermined at first, the manner of death was suspicious. There were no signs of natural causes, no heart attack or stroke. Everything pointed to foul play. Ethan had been so sure that the poison would leave no trace, but he hadn't counted on the expertise of the investigators and the swift science of forensics. As the investigation deepened, Ethan's nerves grew frazzled. He knew they were closing in, but he kept telling himself that it would blow over. After all, there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. He had been careful. The poison had been nearly impossible to detect at first glance. But there was one problem that he couldn't shake: his growing guilt. The pressure was starting to weigh on him, and he could feel it eating away at his every thought. He had gotten what he wanted. Margaret was gone, and her fortune was within his reach. But the taste of victory was far from sweet. The woman who had trusted him, who had relied on him for companionship in her last years, was dead. And it was all because of him. Late at night, alone in his apartment, Ethan replayed the events over and over in his mind. He thought about Margaret's face as she had slowly slipped away, her eyes fluttering shut in confusion and pain. He thought about how he had watched her die and felt nothing but fear. The sense of accomplishment he had expected never arrived. Instead, he was left with a profound emptiness. He had spent so much time and effort calculating every move, and now that it was over, he was more scared than he had ever been. He had gotten away with murder, at least, that's what he thought, but he could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. Every little sound in his apartment, every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with the guilt that gnawed at his conscience. Then, the phone call came. It was from a detective named Sarah Grant, who had been assigned to the case. Ethan had been expecting it. The detectives had made it clear that they would be following up with him. But the phone call was different. Detective Grant informed him that new evidence had surfaced, evidence that linked him to the crime. Ethan's stomach dropped as his mind raced to figure out what the detectives had discovered. He had been careful, hadn't he? He had disposed of all the items that might incriminate him. Yet somehow, they had found something. The detective asked him to come to the station for a more formal questioning. Ethan tried to mask his panic with a calm, measured response, agreeing to meet her later that evening. But inside, his mind was spiraling. How had they found him? What had they uncovered? As he stared at the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be caught in a trap of his own making. Ethan spent the next few hours pacing in his apartment, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had no idea how much evidence the investigators had gathered or how close they were to proving his guilt. The weight of his own actions began to sink in. Margaret's death wasn't just a means to an end. It was irreversible, and no amount of manipulation or lies could undo what he had done. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. When Ethan arrived at the station, he was met by Detective Grant, who led him into an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he sat across from her, trying to keep his composure. She was calm and collected, her demeanor giving away nothing. She began by asking him about the night Margaret had died, the same questions he had answered a dozen times before. But this time her tone was different. There was no sympathy, no casual conversation, just cold, precise questions that seemed to chip away at his defenses with every passing moment. Grant slid a folder across the table to him. It was filled with pictures and documents, evidence from the investigation. As he flipped through the pages, his heart began to race. The photos showed the wine glasses from the dinner he had prepared for Margaret, the traces of poison that had been detected in the residue. There was a blood test that had confirmed the presence of the lethal substance in Margaret's system, and a search of his apartment had uncovered the remains of the poison, carefully hidden away. Ethan felt the walls closing in on him as the detective continued her questioning, her voice steady and unwavering. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Ethan's act had failed. The web he had so carefully constructed had unraveled, and the lies he had woven were exposed for what they were. He had underestimated the persistence of the investigation and the depth of the detective's expertise. His heart sank as he realized that no amount of manipulation could save him now. The life he had dreamed of, one filled with wealth and luxury, was slipping further out of reach. And the worst part was that it wasn't just the police who had begun to turn against him. Margaret's death, the tragedy he had caused, had shaken everyone who had known her, and they were starting to ask questions that Ethan couldn't answer. As Detective Grant continued her questions, Ethan's mind spiraled into panic. The thought that he might spend the rest of his life in prison for his greed and deception was too much to bear. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew that he deserved whatever punishment was coming his way. The life he had stolen from Margaret could never be returned, and no amount of wealth could fix what he had broken. The following days were a blur for Ethan as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. Detective Sarah Grant's careful and relentless questioning had broken him down, piece by piece, until there was no longer any denying the truth. Every lie he had told, every attempt to cover his tracks had been exposed. The evidence was undeniable. Fingerprints on the wine glasses, traces of poison on the utensils he had used to prepare the meal. Even his own nervous behavior that had been recorded during his initial questioning. The investigators had pieced together the puzzle, and Ethan's role in Margaret's death was now clear. In the hours leading up to his arrest, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but he knew there was no way out. His wealth, his charm, and his manipulative tactics had brought him to the edge of success. But now, they were his chains. The very things that had drawn Margaret to him in the first place, the promises of a lavish life, the attention, the care, had been the tools he used to destroy her. And in the end, it was that same hunger for wealth and power that had led to his undoing. As the police arrived at his apartment to arrest him, Ethan felt a strange sense of detachment. He had expected fear, regret, maybe even a fight for his freedom, but instead he felt hollow, as though his soul had already been stripped bare. He had always been calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead, but this time, he had underestimated one thing: the consequences of his actions. His plan had worked at first, but now he stood facing the ultimate punishment: the loss of everything he had worked so hard to gain. His freedom, his future, and his reputation were all slipping away in the hands of the law. Once he was taken into custody, the media quickly picked up on the case. The shocking details of the wealthy, aging widow and her younger lover had captivated the public's attention. Headlines read like sensational fiction. But for Ethan, it was his reality now. His face was plastered on every news outlet, his story twisted into something unrecognizable. He had become the villain in a tale of greed and betrayal, and the world seemed to relish the fall of the once charming young man who had so easily manipulated a woman old enough to be his grandmother. The trial was swift. Prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Photos, toxicology reports, and the chilling facts about how Ethan had laced Margaret's food and drink with poison. He had never anticipated that someone would scrutinize his every move so carefully. In the end, it was his own arrogance that had led to his downfall. He had thought he was smarter than everyone else, that he could outmaneuver the system. But the truth had a way of catching up with him. As he sat in the courtroom hearing the victim impact statements from the people who had loved Margaret, something strange happened. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of what he had done. These weren't just words from strangers. They were people who had known Margaret, who had cared for her, and who were now grieving her untimely and violent death. And in a rare moment of clarity, he realized how much he had destroyed. Margaret had been more than just a means to an end for him. She had been a person, a woman with hopes, dreams, and a legacy that Ethan had taken away. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, Ethan felt no relief. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was harsh, but it was justified. He had stolen a life, and now his own would be spent behind bars, far from the luxury and privilege he had once dreamed of. As the gavel came down, sealing his fate, Ethan's mind raced once more. He had once believed that wealth could buy him everything he wanted, including love and happiness. But in the end, all the money in the world couldn't save him from the consequences of his choices. Ethan's arrest had shocked everyone who had known him. To the outside world, he was a charming young man who had captured the heart of a rich, vulnerable woman. But in the end, he was nothing more than a predator, a man who had used and discarded someone who had trusted him. As he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Ethan thought about Margaret, about her life, and how easily he had taken it from her. There was no way to undo the damage he had caused, and as he was driven away to prison, he knew he would live with the consequences for the rest of his life. In the end, Ethan had gotten exactly what he had wanted, but it was never what he expected. He had taken Margaret's fortune, but in doing so he had lost his own soul, and while he may have thought that a life of luxury would make him happy, he was now left with nothing but a cold, empty future. The price of greed had been too high, and there was no escaping the fact that in the pursuit of wealth, Ethan had lost everything that truly mattered.